to help lead the life of worship and lead the life of the people, but they began to set judges before groups of people who could help give leadership and can help settle disputes. Can you believe that people were arguing back in that day? Right? And they needed someone to help settle disputes. So they put the judges before them. So you had the Levites, the priests who were helping take care of the Ark of the Covenant of God, the essentials of that part of faith, helping them move towards sacrifice and stay connected with God, and judges who helped give leadership to the tribes, the people who were growing. And so we kind of enter into it in that sort of setting as we come into the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. I will back up and share with you more of the story leading up to chapter 8. But today I want to read from 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 20. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice only. Only you should solemnly warn them and show them the ways the king shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of the chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you've chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." Samuel took in what they said and rehearsed it with God. God told Samuel, "Do what they say. Make them a king." Then Samuel dismissed the men of Israel. Go home. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Stories are important. How we got here and what people have lived and how they lived it helps shape who we are. I venture to say that your life is full of stories. Today is Father's Day. I can't help but think of stories because my dad was quite a storyteller. Most of them were great stories of great faith, but some of them were humorous stories. He always liked to revert to the 1.5 years he lived in Texas as a military police. That's the only time he ever left Cumbest Bluff for more than a week at a time. I can almost honestly say that. I don't think, unless he came to camp, as he was a conservation officer, and he came up for camp, but he came home on the weekends. So, but Dad was a storyteller. Stories are important. And learning the stories of faith. How did we get to a king? What's that all about? Why did Israel even want one? I think we have to back up and look at the whole book of 1 Samuel to catch a view. Here you've already caught that this person named Samuel, whoever Samuel is important. And so let me kind of spend today giving us some background and moving us up to the place of where we enter into the passage where the people are choosing a king. Eli was the priest over Israel in the days before Samuel was born. We enter into that story as we enter into the first chapters of 1 Samuel, but what we also see is a couple, Elkanah and his wife Hannah. He had another wife. Sounds familiar, right, if you were with me in Genesis? One wife who was barren, one wife who was not. And it all kind of worked to a different way. Hannah prayed to God that she would have a child. She was childless. And every time they went to make sacrifice and met with Eli, she asked Eli to pray for her to no longer be barren, but to have a son. As time goes on, it wears on Eli's nerve, and he says, go home, God will grant you whatever it is. She was praying at the altar. Eli thought that she had maybe had too much wine, and so he went to see what was going on. There's neat stories. Y'all need to read this stuff for yourself. There's a lot of details I'm not putting in that you would just love, I think, as we go in this. But Eli said to her, get up, God will grant what you want. And the next year, she had a son. And she promised God in her prayer that if she ever had a son, that she would present him as a Nazarite, one who was dedicated to the service of God. There's another Nazarite that comes later, the ones that don't cut their hair and don't drink any strong drink and devote all their time to God. We'll talk about that some other time. But this is the image. This is the model. This is the being consecrated and set aside. So when the child was almost a year old, she took him to Eli, and he lived there with the priest. And he became a Nazarite. His mother would visit him every year to bring him a new jumpsuit that would fit, that was pretty and nice, and to keep him up and going. That's in there too. Just here again, 1 Samuel chapter 1, start there and keep going. And he spent time there. We also get the insight that Eli's sons were wicked. And that they would be the ones that would be the priests next. And it wasn't going that well. That they took bribes, that they were not being holy, that they were not doing what they were called to do. Anyway, long story short, in chapter 3, Eli is lying in the area of the altar and hears a voice say, Samuel, calling him, Samuel, Samuel. And so he gets up and runs to where Eli is and said, here I am, for you called. And Eli said, boy, I'm asleep. Go back. It wasn't me. The third time he woke Eli up, having heard the voice, Eli suspected that the Lord was calling him. And so he said, when you hear the voice again, just simply say, speak, Lord, for your servant listens. God did. Samuel did. And God spoke a word of prophecy to Samuel. And Samuel, in that moment, began to be a leading figure throughout the scriptures in preparation for this moment that I just read about. Samuel listened to God, even though it was a hard word to speak, telling Eli that his sons were going to die and he was going to die. And they would no longer, his family would be the priest. And yet he spoke that word to them. Samuel began to listen. Things went on, and there were battles with the Philistines. That'll come back into play. Remember that term. The Philistines kept coming in and raiding them and throwing over the nation. And so there became a place where it got really intense. And so Eli's sons, this is great stuff, y'all. Eli's sons took the Ark of the Covenant, the thing that had the most precious items representing God, to the battlefront, hoping to cheer the troops on, hoping that if the Israelites who were there fighting the Philistines would see this, that they would be encouraged and pick up. And they did, but the Philistines were bigger than they were. And the Philistines overthrew them. And they not only overthrew them, but they killed Eli's sons. They took the Ark of the Covenant to where they were in their Philistine towns. Having heard of this, there's a passage from 1 Samuel 4, 12 through 18. Immediately a Benjaminite raced from the front lines back to Shiloh, shirt torn and face smeared with dirt. He entered the town. Eli was sitting on his stool beside the road keeping vigil, for he was extremely worried about the chest of God, the Ark of the Covenant. When the man ran straight into town to tell the bad news, everyone wept. They were appalled. Eli heard the loud wailing and asked, "Why this uproar?" The messenger hurried over and reported, Eli was 98 years old then and blind. The man said to Eli, "I've just come from the front, barely escaping with my life." "And so, my son," said Eli, "what happened?" The messenger answered, "Israel scattered before the Philistines. The defeat was catastrophic with enormous losses. Your sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died, and the chest of God was taken." At the words, chest of God, or Ark of the Covenant, Eli fell backward off of his stool where he sat next to the gate. Eli was an old man and very fat. When he fell, he broke his neck and died. He had led Israel for 40 years. I'm telling you, y'all need to read this stuff. That just captured me. Why? Eli is no longer the one who's looked to for leadership. And who will fill that void? And where will that come from? It didn't work out good for the Philistines to have the Ark of the Covenant. They took them to several towns, and everywhere it entered, the presence of God was so strong that it killed off the Philistines with them they being there and caused great harm and disease. So they tied it to 2 young calves, and they sent it back to where it came from. And at Shiloh, it wound up on a hill, and the Israelites recovered the Ark of the Covenant. And in that moment, Samuel stood up. Samuel stood up and called the people back to God, to call the people to trust God once again. This is chapter 7. He makes the sacrifice on behalf of the people and cried out to God that God would protect them. And Samuel took a rock and he set it up between Mizpah and Shin. He called it, anybody know? Ebenezer. Rock of help. Saying this marks the place where God helped us. When you sang that hymn, did you know what that even meant? Here I raise mine Ebenezer. This is where God has helped us. Today we raise an Ebenezer at 10:27 a.m. For God has helped us and made it where we didn't struggle and protected us. Then Samuel gave solid leadership to Israel his entire life. Every year he went on the circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah. He gave leadership to Israel in each of these places, but always he would return to Ramah where he lived and presided from there. And there he was built an altar to God. It's in that context that we hear the passage of today that Samuel's sons didn't turn out to be the best human beings either. And Samuel's sons, even though he set them as judges over Israel, trying to have them follow in his stead and to trust God to lead this people, they saw it as an opportunity to take advantage of. And they took advantage of it. And so the people demanded a king. Demanded a king. And Samuel would be the one who would find that king and anoint that king and set them over Israel. That's next week. But today, hear the message. God warns, Samuel warns the people of what's going to take place. And yet the people still choose to trust in their own understandings than to trust in God who led them. Several things I think here that just highlight it's human nature to want to take things into our own hands, isn't it? And it's always been. It's human nature to want to have it done our way and a little better. And even though Samuel and God warned the Israelites that this king is not going to be good for you, this is what's going to happen, they still preferred to choose their own way and to take matters into their own hand instead of trusting God. The other thing maybe I can highlight there is it's hard to trust God to lead us, to supply us. Trust me, this past year, it's been hard for all of us. But it's been real hard trying to know when to come back, how to come back, what to do, what not to do. How do we care for the people? And how do we set an example of what God would want us to be and to do? We've tried to live into that, but I'm sure there have been moments that have been hard. And I'm sure there have been moments where I have taken control and told God what we needed to do. It's hard not to want to control things. The other thing I notice is that we want someone else to have responsibility other than trusting ourselves or trusting our relationship with God or trusting God to lead us. I tried, but it's their fault. That pastor up there, that leader, that king, he's the one who led us into this. It's human nature. And so I go back to a statement that my dad always used to tell me, be careful what you ask for. Israel will learn that even though they now are like everybody else and have a king, it may not be the best thing in the world for them. But God let them have it. And God continued, even in that moment, to be a God of grace who stepped aside, even in the bad decisions, to walk with them in grace. And later, we see, will carry him through. Well, I know that's a lot, but I invite you to 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 8. And we'll pick up from there next week as we talk about how this began to live out and really the journey we're entering into with the kings. I'm excited about it, and I hope you will be too. And we give thanks to God. This week, maybe, pause for a moment and try not to take things into your own hands, but to trust God to lead. This week, think before you ask, because you need to be careful in what you ask for. And continue to trust God to be with us. I hope that each of you had a chance to receive communion. When we came back into this moment, I wasn't quite ready to have us all at the altar holding hands. Although I really am ready. But I hope you each had a chance to receive the communion packets that you have there. If not, Jason.